Lena Horne. Lena Horne wasn't just a Hollywood star, she was a contract renegade. In 1942, when MGM signed her, they expected another glamorous performer to slot into their system. But Horne had other plans. Her contract included a groundbreaking clause. She would not, under any circumstances, play a maid, nanny, or any other subservient role. In an era when black actresses were almost exclusively cast in such parts, this was unheard of. It wasn't just a demand, it was a declaration. MGM, eager to market her as a star while still appeasing segregated audiences, found a workaround. They gave her roles in films like Cabin in the Sky and Stormy Weather, but structured her scenes so they could be easily cut for theaters in the Jim Crow South. She was glamorous, talented, and undeniably bankable, but Hollywood refused to give her the same romantic leads or dramatic depth offered to white actresses. Horne, however, never backed down. "I don't have to play a maid," she famously said. "I don't have to play a cook, I don't have to play a servant." Her refusal to conform came at a cost. While other black actresses took stereotypical roles just to stay in the industry, Horne walked away from them entirely. She became one of MGM's first black contract stars, but the studio's reluctance to fully embrace her meant she had to carve her own path. She dominated the nightclub circuit, recorded hit songs, and later became a civil rights icon. Some speculate that her contract clause wasn't just about her own image. It was a strategic move to force Hollywood's hand, daring them to create better roles for black performers. Whether or not that was her intent, the precedent she set rippled through generations. Decades later, stars like Dorothy Dandridge and Diahann Carroll would fight for and win roles that Horne was denied. Hollywood may not have given Lena Horne the film career she deserved, but she made sure they would never forget her name. Humphrey Bogart. Humphrey Bogart built his legacy on a gravelly voice, razor-sharp wit, and an on-screen presence that could make even the toughest gangsters nervous. But behind the scenes, Hollywood was working overtime to make sure audiences never questioned his dominance, especially when it came to his height. Standing at approximately 5 feet 8 inches, Bogart wasn't exactly towering over his leading ladies.
You're not very tall, are you?
Well, I tried to be.
And while no contract clause explicitly dictated his stature, industry insiders whisper that Warner Brothers had an unspoken rule: no actress should make Bogart look small. Lauren Bacall, his most famous co-star and real-life wife, stood at about the same height. So, what did Hollywood do? Camera angles, strategic blocking, and even the occasional box under his feet helped maintain the illusion of authority. Some costume designers reportedly tailored his suits with high-waisted trousers and slightly elevated shoes. Not enough to be obvious, but just enough to give him an edge. While there's no surviving document confirming a height clause, the lengths Hollywood went to preserve Bogart's tough guy image suggest it was a priority. And yet, despite all the tricks, it wasn't his height that made him a legend. It was his presence. Proof that sometimes the biggest stars don't need to be the tallest. Jean Harlow. Imagine signing a contract where your hair color wasn't just a preference. It was a legal obligation. That was Jean Harlow's reality. MGM didn't just love her platinum blonde locks, they controlled them. The studio saw her striking look as box office gold, and staying blonde wasn't a suggestion, it was a requirement. Harlow's signature shade wasn't easy to maintain. Her hairstylist, Alfred Pagano, relied on a punishing mix of peroxide, ammonia, and Lux flakes to keep her hair that iconic icy blonde. The process was so harsh it left her scalp irritated and her hair brittle, but MGM wouldn't budge. If she wanted roles, the bleach had to stay. The obsession with her hair sparked endless speculation. Was she naturally that blonde? Harlow played coy, once teasing a reporter. "Now it happens that I am just a natural towhead." But behind the scenes, the truth was clear. Her platinum hair was a carefully crafted illusion. By the mid-1930s, years of relentless bleaching had taken a toll. Her hair was thinning, breaking, and MGM had a decision to make. Instead of pushing the peroxide further, they allowed her to transition to a slightly darker shade, a move that softened her bombshell image. Fans were stunned, but it was a rare moment where Hollywood's rigid beauty standards bent, even just a little. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield didn't just embrace her bombshell image. Some say she had it written into her Hollywood contracts. While no official documents confirm a cleavage clause, insiders suggest that 20th Century Fox strongly encouraged her to wear revealing outfits at public events. Whether it was a formal contract term or just an unspoken rule, Mansfield played along brilliantly. Take the now legendary Paramount dinner party in 1957. Mansfield arrived in a pink satin dress with a plunging neckline that defied gravity. Across the table sat Sophia Loren, whose side eye in that infamous photograph became Hollywood legend. Loren later reflected on the moment, saying, "She knew everyone was watching." Some claim the entire scene was orchestrated, Mansfield's way of ensuring all eyes and cameras stayed locked on her. 20th Century Fox had positioned her as a more approachable, playful alternative to Marilyn Monroe, and they weren't subtle about it. Mansfield was often photographed in daring outfits, sometimes with accidental wardrobe malfunctions that conveniently made headlines. Whether it was studio strategy or her own savvy marketing, she became a walking spectacle, ensuring her name never left the tabloids. But Mansfield wasn't just a publicity stunt. She reportedly had an IQ of 163, spoke multiple languages, and played classical violin. Her daughter, Law & Order SVU star Mariska Hargitay, has defended her mother's legacy, emphasizing that she was far more than just a sex symbol. Still, Hollywood is fickle. By the mid-1960s, the Monroe comparisons had faded, and so had the studio contracts. But if there was ever an actress who understood the power of spectacle, it was Jane Mansfield. Whether or not a cleavage clause ever existed on paper, she made sure the world believed in it. Veronica Lake. Imagine being contractually obligated to wear your hair a certain way every single day. That was the reality for Veronica Lake, whose signature peekaboo hairstyle wasn't just a fashion statement, it was a studio-enforced rule. Paramount Pictures insisted she maintain her cascading blonde waves that draped over one eye, a look so iconic it defined her career in the 1940s. The studio's reasoning? Marketability. Fans copied her style, magazines obsessed over it, and Hollywood even poked fun at it, like in The Major and the Minor, 1942, where a ballroom full of women sported her famous waves. Paramount had turned her hair into a brand, and they weren't about to let her change it. But then came World War II. With women flooding into factory jobs, safety concerns arose. Long, loose hair near heavy machinery was an accident waiting to happen. Lake participated in a government-backed campaign urging women to pin their hair back for safety, even altering her own look in public appearances. It was a patriotic move, but it came at a cost. Fans who had idolized her signature style seemed to lose interest, and Paramount, seeing her diminished appeal, let her contract lapse. Her career spiraled, though other factors, studio politics, personal struggles, played a role in her decline. Decades later, the peekaboo wave remains one of Hollywood's most recognizable hairstyles, recreated by modern stars and immortalized in fashion retrospectives. Veronica Lake may have been bound by contract to maintain her look, but in the end, it wasn't just a clause, it was a legacy. Josephine Baker. Imagine being so famous that you could dictate exactly who got to see you perform, and refusing to entertain segregated crowds no matter the cost. That was Josephine Baker in the 1950s. Her contracts carried a bold clause. She would not take the stage unless the audience was fully integrated. No exceptions. In 1951, Miami's Copa City Club offered her a staggering $10,000 a week deal, an unheard of sum at the time. But there was a catch. Black patrons would be forced into a separate section, as was common in Florida's segregated venues. Baker didn't hesitate. "I cannot work where my people cannot go," she told the club owners. Negotiations stretched on, but she refused to budge. In the end, the club caved, making her show one of Miami's first major integrated performances. Her fight didn't end there. In 1952, she took on Las Vegas, where black guests were routinely turned away from casino showrooms. Performing at the Last Frontier Hotel, she made sure her contract demanded an integrated audience. But when black ticket holders arrived, hotel staff tried to block them at the door. Baker wasn't having it. She stormed to the entrance and laid down the law. Either the venue honored her contract or she walked. The hotel relented, and for the first time a major Las Vegas casino hosted a desegregated crowd. Not every venue gave in. Some canceled her shows outright rather than challenge the status quo. But Baker's stand set a precedent. Other black entertainers, inspired by her defiance, began inserting similar clauses into their contracts, forcing the entertainment industry to confront its role in systemic segregation. While the US fought her at every turn, France embraced her. She had been a superstar in Paris since the 1920s, gaining French citizenship in 1937. She even worked with the French resistance during World War II, smuggling messages for the Allies. And in 2021, she became the first black woman to be honored with a burial at the Pantheon, France's highest posthumous recognition. Josephine Baker wasn't just a performer, she was a force of change. And she proved that sometimes the most powerful statement isn't what you say, it's what you refuse to do. Olivia de Havilland. Imagine being one of Hollywood's brightest stars, only to find yourself trapped in a cycle of uninspired, recycled roles. That was Olivia de Havilland's reality in the 1930s. Warner Brothers had her locked into a contract that saw her playing the same delicate, damsel-in-distress characters over and over again. But de Havilland wasn't about to let her career be dictated by studio executives. She fought back, not with a secret contract clause, but by challenging one of Hollywood's most oppressive rules. In 1943, de Havilland sued Warner Brothers over the studio's notorious suspension clause, a loophole that allowed studios to extend actors' contracts if they refused roles, effectively trapping them in long-term agreements. The case dragged on for over a year, but in 1944 the California Court of Appeal ruled in her favor. The decision, now known as the de Havilland decision, struck down the industry's ability to extend contracts indefinitely, freeing actors from what was essentially Hollywood's version of indentured servitude. Bette Davis, who had fought her own legal battle against Warner Brothers years earlier, was vocal in her support. While some say she credited de Havilland with breaking the industry's stranglehold on actors, the exact wording of her praise remains unclear. What is certain is that this ruling reshaped Hollywood's labor system, giving performers unprecedented control over their careers. Of course, Warner Brothers didn't take the loss lightly. The studio allegedly tried to blacklist de Havilland, discouraging other companies from hiring her, but she wasn't about to disappear. Instead, she pivoted to radio work and even toured with the USO, performing for troops during World War II. When she finally returned to the big screen, she proved she was more than just a studio pawn, winning 2 Academy Awards for Best Actress. De Havilland's fight wasn't just about her own career, it was about artistic freedom. And thanks to her, Hollywood's biggest stars finally had the power to say no. Mae West. Mae West didn't just own the screen, she owned her words. At the height of her fame in the 1930s, West had a contract clause that made Hollywood nervous. No one could change her dialogue without her approval, and she wielded that power like a weapon. When Paramount tried to soften her lines and she'd done him wrong, in 1933 she didn't just push back, she threatened to walk. The studio caved and the film became a massive hit, proving audiences craved her razor-sharp double entendres, no matter how much the censors squirmed. But West wasn't just battling studios. She was outsmarting the Production Code Administration, Hollywood's morality police. They tried to rein her in, but she always found a loophole. In Go West Young Man in 1936, she laced her dialogue with seemingly innocent phrases that carried a wink for those paying attention. Some claim she swapped out explicit references for words like marriage to slip past the censors, though records don't confirm specific substitutions. What's certain is that even when her films were trimmed down, her wit remained intact, and audiences kept coming back for more. Her demand for creative control wasn't limited to movies. When offered the role of Belle Watling in Gone with the Wind in 1939, she reportedly turned it down, not because it wasn't a major film, but because she wasn't allowed to rewrite her lines. At a time when most actresses had little say over their roles, West refused to compromise. She wasn't just a star, she was a brand, and no one was going to dilute it. Her clashes with censors weren't confined to Hollywood. In 1937, she performed a radio sketch on the Chase and Sanborn Hour that was so suggestive it led to an FCC condemnation. NBC banned her from radio for 15 years. Did she back down? Not a chance. She later quipped, "I believe in censorship, I made a fortune from it." Through it all, West remained a box office powerhouse. Even when studios and censors tried to silence her, she proved that audiences craved her brand of humor. Her contract clause wasn't just about dialogue, it was about control, independence, and refusing to be censored in an era when Hollywood tried to tame its most daring voices. Sammy Davis Jr. It's the 1950s and Sammy Davis Jr. is a household name, but fame doesn't exempt him from segregation. In the South, black entertainers can perform on stage but can't sit in the audience, or even stay in the hotels where they headline. Davis decides he's had enough. He adds a bold clause to his contracts: no segregated audiences. If a venue wants him, they integrate, no exceptions. This isn't just a personal stand, it's a direct challenge to the status quo. Some venues refuse outright, fearing backlash. Others receive pressure from local officials to keep things as they are. And then there are the threats. Anonymous letters warning him to stop, whispers of danger if he keeps pushing. But Davis doesn't back down. He walks away from any venue that won't comply. His refusal forces change. In Las Vegas, where black performers are barred from staying in the hotels they play, pressure from Davis and other entertainers leads to negotiations. This culminates in the 1960 Moulin Rouge Agreement, a landmark deal that officially desegregates the city's casinos and hotels. While Davis isn't the sole force behind it, his contract demands set a precedent, proving that star power can be a weapon against injustice. Of course, taking a stand comes at a cost. He loses gigs, he gains enemies, and the hate mail doesn't stop. But his insistence on integrated audiences inspires others. Soon, more black entertainers follow suit, refusing to perform under segregation. What starts as one man's clause in a contract ripples across the industry, breaking down barriers one venue at a time. John Wayne. John Wayne wasn't just a movie star, he was a brand. And that brand had rules. One of the strangest? A contract clause that forbade him from playing weak or vulnerable characters. No physical frailty, no humiliating defeats, and certainly no emotional breakdowns. If John Wayne was on screen, he was winning, period. By the 1940s and 50s, Wayne was Hollywood's undisputed king of the Western and war film genres. His tough, no-nonsense persona was a box office goldmine, and studios were happy to protect it. Directors working with him often had to tweak scripts to ensure Wayne's characters never appeared too compromised. Some industry insiders speculated that this clause was a direct response to the rise of more complex, morally ambiguous leading men. Wayne, on the other hand, wanted to remain an unshakable symbol of strength. One of the clearest examples? The Alamo in 1960, a film Wayne not only starred in, but directed. The real-life Battle of the Alamo was a brutal, desperate last stand, but Wayne's version, his Davy Crockett goes out in a blaze of glory, taking down enemies with him, no surrender, no fear. Even in True Grit nearly a decade later, when playing an aging, one-eyed marshal, Wayne ensured his character was still the toughest man in the room. While some directors may have found this clause restrictive, there's little public record of outright complaints. After all, Wayne was a massive box office draw, and studios weren't about to mess with a winning formula, but it did mean he rarely explored deeply flawed or vulnerable roles, the kind that might have earned him greater critical acclaim. Still, for audiences who grew up watching him, John Wayne wasn't just an actor. He was an icon, and icons don't break. Theda Bara. Imagine signing a contract that dictated not just your career, but your entire identity. That was the reality for Theda Bara, Hollywood's original vamp of the 1910s. Fox Studios didn't just promote her, they invented her. While many silent film stars had carefully curated images, Theda's transformation was extreme. Born Theodosia Goodman in Cincinnati, Ohio, she became an exotic mystery from the Sahara Desert, complete with a fabricated backstory and a name that, according to studio lore, meant Arab death. Fox's control over her public persona was relentless. Bara had to maintain her mystique at all times. No modern clothing, no casual public appearances, and certainly no contradicting the studio's narrative. While there's no surviving contract explicitly stating these rules, Hollywood historians widely agree that her professional obligations left her little choice. Interviews were scripted down to the last word, ensuring she never slipped out of character. Even her off-screen life was a performance. But did she resent it? That's where things get murky. Some sources suggest she embraced the persona, working alongside her publicist Frank Powell to craft the illusion. Others argue she was trapped by it, unable to shed the vamp image even as audiences moved on. By the mid-1920s, the silent era's fascination with dark, mysterious seductresses had waned, and with it, so did Theda's career. She retired in 1926, her legend sealed but her stardom fading into history. Theda Bara's case was an early example of Hollywood's obsession with image control, an industry practice that would only grow more intense in the decades to come. But few stars were ever as completely consumed by their own myth as she was. Gene Simmons. Gene Simmons wasn't about to let Hollywood dictate her body. At a time when studios controlled everything from an actor's hairstyle to their love life, Simmons reportedly negotiated contracts that shielded her from one of the industry's most ruthless demands: forced weight loss. While many rising stars were pressured into extreme dieting or given amphetamines to maintain a studio-approved figure, Simmons refused to play along. By the late 1940s, she was already an established star, and she had seen what the system did to actors who didn't fit its rigid beauty ideals. Studios had notoriously placed stars like Judy Garland under strict weight mandates, even resorting to dangerous methods to keep them thin. But Simmons, who signed with RKO and later 20th Century Fox, reportedly ensured her contracts included a clause that prevented producers from forcing her into drastic weight changes. That didn't mean the pressure disappeared. Some accounts suggest certain producers still tried to push her towards slimming down for roles, but Simmons held firm. She knew her worth wasn't tied to a number on a scale, and her career proved it. She thrived in Hollywood, starring in films like Guys and Dolls and Spartacus, all while maintaining control over her own body, a rare feat in an era when studios wielded near total power over their stars. Rita Hayworth. Imagine signing a contract that dictates not just your career, but your very identity. For Rita Hayworth, one of Hollywood's most glamorous stars, that was reality. When she arrived at Columbia Pictures in the late 1930s, she was Margarita Carmen Cancino, dark-haired with a low hairline that reflected her Spanish heritage. But studio head Harry Cohn had a different vision. He wanted her to embody Hollywood's ideal of all-American beauty, and that meant transformation, whether she liked it or not. First came the name change, then the grueling physical alterations. Hayworth endured painful electrolysis treatments to raise her hairline, permanently reshaping her face. But the most defining change? Her hair color. Cohn decided she would be a redhead, and once that decision was made, there was no going back. Buried in her contract was an unusual clause. She could not change her hair color without studio approval. It wasn't just a preference, it was a mandate. Even in her personal life, she had to maintain the fiery red locks that had become her trademark. This wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about branding. Cohn believed Hayworth's red hair was essential to her allure, and he enforced the rule with an iron grip. When Orson Welles, her then-husband, convinced her to lighten her hair for The Lady from Shanghai in 1947, the backlash was immediate. Cohn was furious. He hadn't been consulted, and the drastic change sent shockwaves through Hollywood. Some fans were outraged, believing she had abandoned the image they adored. The film flopped at the box office, and many blamed the makeover. Cohn never let her forget it. Hayworth herself grew frustrated. She was one of the most famous women in the world, yet she had no control over something as personal as her own appearance. Years later, she reflected on the suffocating grip Columbia had on her, saying, "I used to have to punch a time clock at Columbia. Every day of my life. That's what it was like. I was under exclusive contract, like they owned me." And in many ways they did. Her image wasn't just her own. It was a commodity, carefully controlled and sold to the public. The no red hair clause wasn't just about hair dye. It was a symbol of how little autonomy stars had in Hollywood's golden age. Their faces, their bodies, their identities all were shaped by the studios, often at great personal cost. And for Rita Hayworth, the woman behind the legend, the price of fame was losing the freedom to be herself. Judy Garland. Judy Garland was barely a teenager when MGM signed her, but by 16 she was already one of Hollywood's biggest stars, and under relentless scrutiny. Her contract didn't just dictate her films, it controlled her body. The studio enforced a strict weight clause, threatening suspension if she didn't comply. Executives decided she needed to look thinner, younger, more marketable, and they had no qualms about how they achieved it. Her diet? Practically non-existent. Studio handlers restricted her to chicken soup, black coffee, and a constant supply of cigarettes, though reports on the exact number vary. When that wasn't enough, MGM doctors prescribed amphetamines to suppress her appetite and keep her energized for grueling marathon-length workdays. Then, when the stimulants left her too wired to sleep, they handed her barbiturates to knock her out. It was a vicious cycle, orchestrated by the very people profiting from her talent. Studio head Louis B. Mayer reportedly called her "my little hunchback," mocking her for not fitting Hollywood's rigid beauty standards. Even after The Wizard of Oz made her a household name in 1939, MGM still saw her as an awkward misfit. They forced her into corsets, reshaped her nose with rubber discs, and even bound her chest to make her look younger. Every inch of her appearance was micromanaged. But the real damage wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The relentless criticism shattered her self-esteem and set her on a lifelong struggle with addiction. The very pills MGM gave her as a teenager became a crutch she could never escape. By 1950, after years of overwork and substance-related struggles, the studio dropped her entirely. Yet despite everything, Garland delivered some of Hollywood's most legendary performances, proving that even under impossible pressure, her talent was unstoppable. If you've enjoyed this video, please leave a like and comment. Also consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell to get notified of our new videos each week. Thanks for watching.